Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. It's Thanksgiving week here in the U.S., so I'm just trying to downshift or decompress from my job for a little while. I mean, I did wind up on a client call at 6 p.m. on Monday, but I also managed to make progress on the second issue of Haiku for Business Travelers, which just thrilled me. Like, I'd thought about doing a second issue and I had ideas for what would go in it, but on Monday morning, once I finally opened up the template for the issue and started laying it out, I found myself getting totally charged up just to finish some of the prose pieces and figure out how it's all going to come together. Also, I devoured Vivian Gornick's The Situation and the Story this weekend, which helped me figure out a way to tell one of the big stories that I want to put in this issue about the time I met and charmed the pants off of Princess Elizabeth of Yugoslavia. This all goes back to the 90s, and the pants thing is figurative, not literal, but in Vivian's parlance, I had the situation, but not the story. And now I think I've got the story. Of course, the proof will be in the writing. But the upside is I'm writing, And I hope to have the issue done by next month so I can mail it out to people before 2021 hits. It'll be free, so if you want a copy, let me know. I still have some copies left of issue number 1, too, so I'm fine with sending stuff out in the mail. Anyway, that's something I am legit excited about, and I'm just hoping the mania propels me past the anxiety, which usually cripples me. Anyway, let's get to this week's show. My guest this time is Rian Hughes, author of the amazing new novel XX from Picador in the UK and Overlook Press in the US. Ryan is a graphic designer, typographer, designer, illustrator, comic artist, writer, photographer, and probably a bunch of other things that I'm missing. With XX, he is publishing his first prose fiction, and it's a doozy. In short, XX is a science fiction novel about a signal from space. It is also 1,000 pages long, so in short doesn't really cover it. XX is so much more than that, and it takes all of that for Ryan to work out all the threads and implications of the concepts that he brings into this one. XX explores information theory, it's semiotics, memetics, futurism, and culture wars, and the various artistic movements of century upon century, and how they intersect with technology and story space and so much more. And Ryan uses the medium of the book as the message, as it were. The novel incorporates a whole bunch of different prose and visual forms and uses typography in a whole ton of innovative ways, which makes an art object out of the book itself. Ryan's this phenomenal designer, and the book is impeccably laid out and designed. Just flipping through it will give you an idea of the visual variety of the work. But it's not there as window dressing. Everything is in service of the story and the concepts that Ryan's working with. Each font choice and the non-prose episodes all builds upon it, upon that issue of how we say what we say and how ideas make their way in the world. And even though, like I said, it's 1,000 pages long, I found myself reading XX pretty compulsively. One of the upshots of Rian's great design eye is that some pages either aren't dense with prose or they consist of art rather than writing. So he knows how to pace these things to keep the reader engaged. Plus, the story itself is really engaging. There is a section that takes place on the moon that literally had me on the edge of my seat, just dying to find out what was going to happen, worrying about this one character. It's really a fantastic book. That said, I do recommend reading it at a desk or table because otherwise it could wear a groove in your hand, however you're holding it. Anyway, as we talk about in this conversation, XX covers a lot of territory and ideas that were sort of formative for me in college and beyond. So I'm thrilled to see someone actually make art out of it. I tell you more about the book itself and the story and what the signal from space is and what human reaction to all of this is. But Rian gets into that in the conversation itself, so I'm not going to go into too many details here. All I can say is reading XX is an unforgettable experience. So go pick it up. It's literally the letter X twice. Also, I apologize for not talking more about comics with Rian, but we have talked about how we will do that the next time we get together. My intro to his work actually was in the mid-90s when he collaborated with Grant Morrison on a revisionist comic of the British science fiction hero Dan Dare. He had this great mid-century drawing style, and I always kept an eye on his work after that, even down to the logos he was designing, like for Grant Morrison's comic, The Invisibles. There's a collection of some of his comics work actually called Yesterday's Tomorrows from Knockabout Press, which you also ought to check out. Now, here's Rian's bio from XX. There's a more extensive one at his website, ryanhughes.com. Rian Hughes is a graphic designer, illustrator, comic artist, and typographer who has worked extensively for the British and American advertising, music, and comic book industries. He has written and drawn comics for 2000 AD and Batman Black and White, and designed logos for the Avengers, the X-Men, Superman, record label Head Candy, MTV, and James Bond. He has edited books on mid-century lifestyle illustration and custom typography, and written on semiotics, culture, and collecting vintage science fiction pulps and paperbacks. Oh yeah, that's a thing in XX I forgot to mention. He does a pastiche of a 1950s, early 60s pulp science fiction novella, and the end papers of the book are the covers he designs for this fictional magazine that collected this fictional novella. There's a lot of metafictional stuff going on in XX. Like I say, go give it a read. But now, it's time for the Virtual Memories conversation with Rian Hughes. Yeah, how long did XX take to write?
It probably took about 3.5 years, and then there was about a year of before the contracts with Picador were signed, and then about another 1.5 years before it finally came out. So the whole process was quite long-winded. But prior to that, I'd had the idea for a narrative graphic design novel for maybe 25 years. Prior to that, and just hadn't got around to doing it. But it was always there in the back of my head. In fact, I spoke about it in an interview in a magazine in around the sort of mid-90s, perhaps. So it was just a case of finally putting aside the time to sit down and make this thing happen.
And what I wonder, back in the 90s, desktop publishing and all this was taking off, and well, I couldn't have done my job as a trade magazine editor if it involved manual paste up, because my magazine would have looked like it was made by a serial killer. But what I wonder, back then when you first had the idea, would it have been feasible? I know the technology existed, but computing power would have made it really difficult to do a lot of the the typography and the interesting ways you use to lay the whole thing out.
Yeah, no, you're right. The technology was still in its infancy, and although I did have a Mac, I think I bought my first 2CI in '93, something like that, and then taught myself. I'd never used a computer prior to that, other than the occasional video game, but the technology was still in its infancy, and it probably could have been done then, but it would have been extremely long-winded and tedious in something like Quark Express and Fontographer to do the fonts. I mean, it would have been possible, but I think that it became more to the fore as I was involved in comics around that time as well, and all the comics that I was drawing, I did with paper and pen and paint, the old analog tools. And I had started developing an illustration style on the Mac in freehand and then in Illustrator that turned out to be hugely popular, to the point where there were dozens of people knocking me off, and even my mum would mention some post that she'd seen that she assumed that I'd drawn that wasn't me at all. It was someone pretending to be me. And so but I always wanted to return to that narrative aspect of comics that I missed in straightforward illustration. The fact that with comics you're coming to the comic for the comic, and whereas with illustration you're generally decorating someone else's idea. You're glorified marketing rather than artist. And I know that a lot of illustrators will argue the toss between art and illustration and design, and it's an argument that I think is less interesting than whether something is of a good quality and has interesting ideas in or not. I think that's more salient than the label that you give it. But one of the things that began to annoy me about illustration was that I was continually answering rather dull briefs in the service of some product that I had no interest in. And I wanted to get back to the more authorial ways of comics, but somehow fold all the graphic design tricks that I'd learned along the way, and the illustration tricks and the font design tricks along the way into the service of some narrative, whatever that narrative would be. I hadn't decided what that was yet.
And when I was first exposed to your work, you were the artist working with other writers like Grant Morrison for the Dan Dare series. When did you develop the confidence in yourself as a writer? And we'll talk about the book in concert with that, but when did you find your voice, I suppose?
I'm not sure that I have yet. No, it's when you work with someone like Grant, who I did almost from the outset. In fact, we were talking just a few days ago for the US launch of XX, courtesy of Strand Books, and because I've known Grant for so long, and we kind of finish each other's sentences, and our interests are very, very similar, and because he is such an impressive writer, I kind of assumed that the writing bit was always something that I would get someone else of the caliber of Grant to do. But eventually it got to the point where I realized that if I was going to make this thing happen, I would have to do it myself, and I couldn't explain it to someone else and then get them to write what it was that I envisaged. It just wasn't going to happen that way. So I just had to bite the bullet and try and write this thing myself. And whether I'm a good writer or not, I wait for the audience to tell me.
How's the response been so far?
Well, this is the amazing thing. The response has been phenomenal, and much to my surprise as well. I mean, first of all, I finished this thing and I did a physical printout of it using print-on-demand technology. So I had this brick of a book that resembled how the actual book would look if you printed it. And I thought that would be the best way to sell it to someone, because if I handed someone a manuscript, it would just not communicate what it was that I was trying to do. So it was very much the final thing that I was touting around. And so my agent sent this out to various people. And then there, much to my surprise, there ended up by being a bit of a bidding war between two publishers. Picador won that, and Picador are a mainstream literary publisher, so they sort of saw in it something above and beyond the science fiction elements of it, which I was very gratified for. Not that I have anything against labeling things as science fiction, and the fact that some people see genre as a pejorative term, I don't at all, but it meant that there was a stable there that presumably Picador thought that I might fit in with. And right up to the point of publication, I had no real idea how it would be received. I mean, the test readers had been mostly been very complimentary. Some of them have been very helpful, but in a very critical way. But that's kind of what you need when you're asking people's opinions in the early stages. So that all fed into it. But the SFX, the Financial Times, the Daily Mail, some really amazing reviews from people who completely got what it was that I was trying to do here, which I didn't know whether people would just be completely bemused by all this typographic shenanigans and find it impenetrable, but it seems that that's not been the case.
No, I think you managed to keep a narrative rolling through the entire 980 pages, which is what my US edition comes out at. And, well, to be honest, it's the novel that I would have tried to write, not necessarily with the typographical elements, but it catches so many aspects of the things that I was grooving on in my 20s, which would have been the early 90s. You nail all these different aspects of, mimetic theory, communications, linguistics, signal from space, and everything else. I'm like, this was the book for me. This is great. So yeah, I enjoyed the living heck out of it. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think you do regurgitate things that have influenced you and impressed you from a very early age. And in this book, I was referencing, say, the early work of Arthur C. Clarke, things like Childhood's End and Rendezvous with Rama, and 2001, obviously, where you have this opening up of the stage that human beings are on to the universe. So all of a sudden we find we live in this much expanded sort of vision of the cosmos, and it transforms us as well as our identity. I'll start that again. It's transformative, not just in terms of what we encounter out there, but in terms of how we as human beings are transformed by that, which is the story of every first encounter, say the Spanish in South America, all of these ways in which the sort of mimetic and biological
exchange, they kind of parallel each other.
Yeah, but there's an exchange there that doesn't always work out for the best, especially when people have no you get it's not just an invasion of ideas of a certain culture maybe eradicating or influencing another culture, but you get the biology, you get the diseases that one group may not have any immunity to. So something like syphilis or smallpox might pass one way, where other ideas might pass another way. I mean, this again is the underlying story of Wells' War of the Worlds. There's what destroys the Martians in the end is not our technological superiority, but the germs that they have no response to. So it's almost like the Earth has an autoimmune response built into it to protect it against alien ideas. So the in the story, the invasion, if you like, is not so much a physical invasion. It's an invasion of alien concepts, and the idea that in the long run, maybe the alien concepts or the foreign concepts are actually more dangerous and can influence and change societies in a much more permanent and wide-ranging way than sort of simple bullets and tanks might do.
Mm. And it's a weird question, but again, based on the fact that, this book is very much a designed piece of work. Was there an aspect of that your publisher and or printer hated the most in terms of just like, how are we going to reproduce this, and this is going to become an issue? Was there any pushback in that respect with it?
Not at all. I think they saw it as the kind of USP that enthused them. And as I wrote it directly into InDesign, so I was typing in the font that the character was talking in, which I think was an essential part of this. There was immediate feedback as to what this would look like. So it didn't exist in a manuscript form at any point. It always looked like how it was going to look. I supplied a print-ready PDF, so the printer had very little to do other than plug my print-ready PDF into the system. I would imagine that translations, we're doing a German edition, are going to be a headache and a half, but hopefully I don't have to personally get involved in that.
That is exactly one of my questions, because Nora Krug, illustrator, and she did a graphic memoir about her family's history in Germany. It's written in English, but so many of the pages are designed so intricately. I asked her, how are those enormous compound German words going to fit in the translations? Like, that's their problem. They can figure it out.
I have no idea what it's going to look like and how it's going to happen, but we'll see.
Indeed. And I guess the other question, it is 980 pages, and I've seen in interviews you mentioned cutting it down to 980 pages. Is there a sidebar, secondary story you do in the XX universe, incorporating the stuff that didn't make it?
I don't think so. I think that there was a subplot that I have sort of referenced in another work that may see the light of day one day, but it's been stripped of all the characters and has nothing to do with this novel whatsoever. It was just it would take a while to explain how it actually worked into the main plot, but it was just the easiest piece to excise. When I realized that the page count was getting approaching 1,000 pages, I just realized that I had to be somewhat more brutal than I was being with taking material out. I'm sure there are those who would argue that I should have taken even more out, but I guess it's a question of taste.
Again, there was a joke years ago when William Gaddis published, I believe, the novel J.R., which was around 900 pages, and the author John Barth said he steadfastly refused to read it, feeling that nobody could accomplish that, and they wouldn't need more than 750 pages, which was the length of his previous book. So, there's always that literary one-upmanship when it came to those sort of massive encyclopedic pieces of literature. But the thing I sort of wonder about finding those voices for we'll say the three lead avatars, which is as much of a spoiler as I'll give about, what those voices are, finding the three sort of distinct voices and the typography for those three characters. How early on in the process did that occur to you, or was it something that grew as you started working through the book?
It's a good question. It's how ideas develop and take you in ways that maybe you didn't envisage, but are entirely appropriate developments is one of the kind of intriguing and surprising aspects of doing this. I mean, because it's my first novel, I was coming to a lot of these aspects as a newbie. So I'd imagine that seasoned writers know when to spot these opportunities that come their way and work them into the plot. These sort of unexpected but entirely appropriate resonances that come about. But it's a bit like, the way I approached it was the same way that I'd approached, say, a piece of graphic design or a life drawing, is that you have a very, you have an overall concept that everything has to adhere to, but within which you have a reasonable amount of play. So the details might have some degrees of freedom as long as they're in the service of the overall idea. So with the characters that you mention, I knew that they were the personifications of certain periods, sort of, the 20th century, the 19th century, 21st century. And I started with XX, mainly because that's the century of the emergence of modernism in the arts. So sort of early on, you get the futurists, the lettrists, concrete poetry, things like this. Later on, you get stuff that I grew up with. So you get punk and the sort of experimental graphic design that sort of came along after that. So I see the 20th century as being very much the century of the modern, and so XX is the amalgamation and the summation of all of those artistic and literary movements on the page. But having pinned that down and sort of worked out what kind of character he was, I then took that and extended it backwards and forwards, which is how we get the 19th count going backwards. And one would presume many more D-men going further back into prehistory. And Girl 21 moving forwards. So they were the kind of logical ramifications of the original XX character. And the rest of it kind of followed very naturally from that. I think if you flesh out your original conceit well enough, there are ramifications of that conceit that become apparent to you, and then you can use. And if you define it's a bit like in graphic design. If you define the problem clearly, the solution is almost always immediately apparent. And if you can't find a solution, quite often it's because you haven't defined the problem well. And the last thing you want to do in graphic design is just be pushing colors and shapes around on the page in the hope that something will cohere, because that's how, say, a graphic designer who hasn't got any kind of concept or idea or end point in mind might work. It's just noodling rather than structuring something with building an edifice with a purpose in mind. But having said that, there were elements that had quite a high degree of freedom, and although I knew what the main sort of beats of the novel were, and I actually wrote those first, so even before I knew who the characters were in aspects of their personality, and I even had placeholder names for them. I knew precisely what, say, the first incursion into idea space was going to be like, so I wrote that. I knew exactly what the encounter that Dana has on the moon was going to be, so I wrote that. And I also knew how the very last, say, 4 or 5 pages were going to play out, and so I wrote that as well. But these were all without any real idea of what the connecting tissue would be between these points. And then the analogy I would give, it's a bit like how I was taught to do figure drawing at art school, is that you don't start in the top left-hand corner and sort of draw the eyelashes on an eye, and then a couple of hours later you're in the bottom right-hand corner adding the toenail, and then you step back and then for the first time understand what the whole thing that you've drawn is, because that whole thing is probably going to be a complete mess. What you do is you put in a very simple line that might indicate where the spine is, or the angle of the hips or the shoulders, and then you step back and you think, is that right? And you correct it if it's not. And then you might put the legs and the arms on just as single lines and a circle for the head. And then you step back again and you think, is there life in that? Does it look like the model? Is the stance and the weight of it right? And then you might sort of flesh out the arms and put a bit of musculature on it. But what you're doing is you're keeping the whole thing very flexible especially at the beginning where you're still not entirely sure what the shape of this thing you're attempting is, the more flexibility that you can build in, the more you can step back and adjust and perfect. And laying the whole thing out in InDesign. So I had color-coded chapters. All the chapters are only about 4 or 5 pages, and I color-coded them all. So I could see exactly where these fell within the structure of the entire thing. And I could move them around and interlace them so that when you've got 2 or even 3 narrative threads that are paralleling each other and you're cutting between sort of Jack and Co. in Hoxton and the far side of the moon and Jodrell Bank, I knew exactly how these interleaved in a very visual way. So I think I, again, just imported a lot of the tricks that I'd learned as a graphic designer into this. I have no idea if that's how, other writers approach stuff, or whether they have a more free form, a more intuitive way of doing it and a less structured way of doing it. But in this case, this is what worked here and worked for me.
Do you have a strictly prose writer friends / colleagues, anyone you can bounce those sorts of things off of? Or did you find yourself in the gonna work blind on this and this is where I'm going with it, don't want to get too influenced by somebody else's process?
I find talking about process really interesting, because you can get some really key insights, even if it's just how other people do things completely differently from how you might do things. But I think that underlying most successful creative endeavors is keeping your eye on the big picture. What is it I'm trying to say here? What are the points I'm trying to make? And then everything is subservient to that. I remember listening to, I can't remember who it was now, an author talk about their method whereby they would write during the day and then go to sleep having no idea what these characters would do the next day, then get up, read what they'd written, and then just write another chapter or two, and eventually get to the end of a novel. And that for me is like starting with the eyelashes in the top left-hand corner and ending up with the toenail in the bottom right-hand corner. I think the chances are you're not going to get something that is shaped in any kind of cohesive way. If you do, it might be accidental, unless you go back and rework it, having seen what the shape is, and bring that shape out by some heavy editing. But that through line, that knowing where you need to be at certain places throughout the book, and especially knowing where you have to end up, where all the characters have to be in the final scenes. I have no idea how people would write something not knowing that from the outset. But horses for courses, I guess.
And what got you into science fiction? Or at what age were you? The joke is the golden age of science fiction is 12, but what was your sort of intro into SF?
I would agree. I think that science fiction was pretty much the first fiction that I encountered, and I can tell you the first science fiction book I ever read. It was called Sargasso of Space by Andre Norton, very prolific America. Are you familiar with Andre Norton? Yeah. Sort of, people compare her to the juveniles that Robert Heinlein wrote early in his career, and they are quite similar in a lot of ways. They're generally a young teen encountering some test of his character, whether that be on an alien planet or being thrown forward or backward in time or something like that, and then coming out of it a better person because of that. They're very much coming of age stories told sometimes with a bit of magic, sometimes with a bit of hard science. But Sargasso of Space, I remember, completely bowled me over, and part of that, in fact, it's a trope that turns up in a lot of Andre Norton novels, is this kind of slow exploration of, say, an alien planet or a hidden cave system or some lush green alien world. And I think that sort of fed into the scenes where you've got Dana exploring the caverns on the moon. That was very much me channeling my
Your inner
remembrance of early Andre Norton. But I think then what happened is that probably too early, I then dived into books that I just could not make head nor tail of. So I would pick up, say, a Philip Dick novel, age 13, and just not understand what I was reading.
Yeah.
So there was a period where I didn't read much science fiction at all. Probably most of my later teens and up through my 20s, I had very little to do with science fiction. And I find myself sort of now coming back into the field, and my reference points are all people like Arthur C. Clarke or Jack Vance or Philip Dick. My reference points are people who probably wrote their most famous work in the late 60s, early 70s, and I have very, very little idea of what has happened in science fiction, especially in the last 20 years, with the odd exception of people like Neil Stevenson or William Gibson, people like that, that sort of filtered through into quote-unquote more mainstream literature. So I feel like I'm very much out of the loop, and my knowledge of science fiction is derived from a period, probably from about 1955 to about 1975, and nothing much outside of that.
You'll see, you're going to be thrown into the deep end of the pool with XX. I could imagine if we didn't have the pandemic, the book tours and all that stuff, the amount of interaction you would have with younger or more recent authors, that could start just overloading you with idea space, with a whole lot of ideas and concepts that have been gestating in the field for quite a while. I'm the same way with comics in some respect. My golden age peaked in the 80s and early 90s, and there was a stretch I didn't know anybody from the past 10 to 15 years, and sort of had to do a pretty steep learning curve. But we all have those.
But I think that I think it's sadly just the byproduct of getting a bit older. I mean, there was a time when I would be able to tell you exactly who had gone up and who had gone down in the top 20 and the fads and fashions of popular culture in an incredible amount of detail, almost on a weekly basis, because I think you're living it and you're there, you're going to the clubs, you're seeing the bands, you're buying the records. And then you swap a very narrow view of culture, where you're into something very deep but very narrow. You swap that for something a bit broader but essentially shallower, because you can't do both. And I'm not entirely sure that a broader understanding of culture isn't the better understanding. You can sort of see the larger picture rather than the minutiae of whatever it is. But what has been happening in the last 20 years in science fiction? Can you fill me in?
It's young people. I go to just one or two literary science fiction events during the year when we're able to travel. But yeah, I'm on the outside of a lot of the genre stuff. I would go to these events and then go hang out with like Peter Straub and Samuel Delany and people like that, guys who were writing in the 60s and 70s. So I was always I'm going to go hang out with the guys who were writing when I was just being born, but the people who were insanely influential. So I can probably get you a primer on some of this stuff and try and get you up to speed afterwards.
Yeah, please do.
Because I have a feeling you're going to fall into that world with a book like this.
Well, I probably am, and I'm probably going to have to do a bit of homework so I don't trip over myself. But I think it's always the way, isn't it? I think that, when I was 12 and 13, you think that the past is another country and you want nothing to do with it, and you're going to reinvent everything from the ground up. And then, decades on, you realize that's exactly what every generation thinks, and they're busy doing it under your nose right now, and it's got very little to do with you, and neither would they want you to have anything to do with it. So it's all well and good, and what goes around comes around.
Yeah, I think that's the cultural, and that's what you capture with the avatars and the way the internet embodies this sort of stuff. Certainly, that sense of every cultural product, whether it's comics, prose, the various subsectors of prose, music, etc., it's always we're the new generation. We're here to rip up the foundations, or we don't even want to know what the foundations are. We're going ahead and making our own thing. If anything, it gets a little easier to adopt that mindset now. At least my theory on this is that with those advances in technology in all of these fields, you can do these things. You can get pretty far without knowing the legacy and the, all the work that came behind you. Which I think is regrettable, but I can make this podcast out of nothing. And when I interviewed Clive James a few years ago, he was in awe that I could just show up with a little satchel that had my entire recording studio in it. Because he was used to doing interviews and having a film crew and having 3 sound people and all of this other stuff back when he was doing TV. And he's like, it's just so remarkable that you can just get on a plane, show up at my house and do this, where, once upon a time, it took this big infrastructure to put together.
Yeah, well, it's the democratization of everything that the digital world has enabled. It's put all of these very sophisticated tools right into the hands of the creatives, for good and for bad. I mean, if you democratize anything, you get, because you bypass the gatekeepers of quality, you get much more bad stuff. You get much more middling stuff, but you also get the geniuses that the gatekeepers wouldn't have comprehended coming through as well. And I would not have been able to do this if I'd have been working with some hot metal typesetter who I'd have had to have instructed piker by piker on how to lay this book out. I would not have been able to design my own fonts and set pages in my own fonts. I would have had to have found some hot metal foundry that would have cast them for me in all the different point sizes that I needed. It would have been a ridiculous undertaking. So again, the democratization that the Macintosh, Adobe, FontLab, Glyphs, Photoshop, all of these tools that have all come to the fore in the last 30 years have made all of this possible. And prior to that, I just don't think that you were so restricted by the technology of the day. And although the Dadaists and the Lettrists and all of these people used the available typefaces of the day in very, very inventive ways, they still had a limited palette that they were making the most of. They weren't utterly free to create exactly what they saw in their mind's eye.
And when you talk about that, you're also a contributor to that world, not just through making fonts yourself, but also the catalogs, the multi-decade catalogs of past fonts and typography that you've helped, we'll say, assemble. I don't even know the best term to use for collecting those and putting those into books. I guess that question then is, how has graphic design and typography changed for you over the years? I mean, I know just the transition to digital is absolutely massive, but, how's it changed for you over the years?
Well, I had an interest in typography from a very early age because my father was an architect and he had in his studio sheets of Letraset and this Letraset catalogue, which I still have somewhere. And I can remember poring over this and just being fascinated by these variations on the form, 26 uppercase, 26 lowercase letters, numbers, punctuation, but the myriad ways that you could express emotion and style and a period through the design of these letter forms. I was completely seduced by this. Of course, at the time, unless you worked at Letraset or Monotype, you were never ever going to see your own fonts in use. But this must have been when I was 12, 13, something like that. I would draw my own typefaces out very, very carefully with a rotring pen on graph paper and then send them off to places like Letraset. And they would send me back these very nice letters, sort of encouraging me to keep at the font design. I wasn't called font design then. Keep at typeface design. And I think that very much fed into my enthusiasm for graphic design more generally. I mean, at that early age, I didn't even know that there was a thing called graphic design or type design. I think I just thought it was all part of art in a very broad sense. It was all part of creating things. So I didn't have these sort of mental categories that defined high from low, or commercial from personal. They were all just the joyous creation of amazing stuff that sort of fired up my imagination. And and then of course I remember buying a really early version of Fontographer, which was simple and by today's standards quite basic, but it did the job, and you could create a font that you could then set your own words in, which for me was an absolute revelation. I could get books or magazines back, and the text setting, not just the headline setting, which I'd been doing up to then, but the text setting as well was in a font of my own design. I just thought this was the most amazing and incredible thing. So I think it was about then that I thought that some form of narrative design, which basically was it was a combination of what I was doing in comics at that time and what I was doing in graphics at that time, and wondering how I could amalgamate these two and what the thing would look like when I managed to do it. And, all these years later, that is XX.
Mm-hmm. You have a favorite era for typography and design?
I used to think I did, but I think your tastes change and broaden. Like we were talking earlier about you. I'm sure you remember absolutely loathing some band or other just because you were a future.
I didn't get Jack Kirby. When I was a kid, I did not get Kirby. It took till I was in my 20s when I had wait a second. Okay, now I understand.
It's funny. So, yeah. It's funny you should say that, because so many people have said the same thing. And I encountered Jack Kirby quite early in black and white reprints. So I was looking at 50s Jack Kirby, probably in the 80s. But I can remember getting Jack Kirby. And I think what you're doing when you're younger is you're asking apples to be oranges. You're not understanding that one thing is not that thing, but it's another thing. And if you shift your criteria, you'll understand why that thing is good. And as soon as you see Jack Kirby in terms of the kind of kinetic way that he can choreograph a fight scene, or the way that he can fill three-dimensional space with these seemingly solid masses of, the Hulk's body or whatever it may be, that's his skill. That's something that he does like nobody else. Then you can understand what it is that makes Jack Kirby Jack Kirby. And it's a bit like, when you're into one kind of music, and that might be, I don't know, loud punky music, and you just cannot get your head around singer-songwriters. And then one day you realize what it is that they're doing is not what you think that they're doing. It's some other thing. And then once you approach them and understand what their criteria are, you've met them halfway. And it's a bit like the phrase I use for this is called getting disco. And I think that there was a point in my life where I just could not understand what disco was all about. But then I was listening to Joy Division and things like that. And then one day I was sitting in this publisher's office, and Maceo and the Max, Cross the Tracks, came on the radio. And for some reason, it just cut through all my preconceptions, and I realized what this thing was. And it was like almost like a religious conversion. And I understood that it was less about these introspective lyrics that I'd been concentrating on, and it was more about sort of beats and structures, and the words really didn't matter. They were just sort of another instrument in the service of the structure of this piece of music. And so as your appreciation broadens, it's a bit like what we were saying earlier, is that you have a broader but probably less deep appreciation that comes with age, maybe. But I think that is healthy. I mean, it's a bit like, you can see comic book artists who have learned how to draw comics by looking at other comic book artists. And so they may be very good comic book artists, but they bring nothing to their art from outside of that very narrow domain. And the same is true of musicians, the same is true of fine artists, the same is true of every single field of human endeavor. It is that there are people who are very good. They're almost like pastiches of everything that's come before, but there's nothing really new and exciting because they're not bringing stuff in from a sort of a wider lived experience. And one of the problems that I had very early on when I was designing comics, and this is sort of say in the 90s, is that I could see that comic book graphic design was designed by designers who were only looking at comic book graphic design. And if you put your average comic book in a record store, it would just scream Jack Kirby, Marvel, EC Comics. Yeah. It was so imbued in this very narrow linear history of graphic design that it almost existed in splendid isolation from the history of, say, advertising or record sleeve design or any other field of graphic, or architecture or fine art. It referenced very little of those. You had the odd person like Steranko who would reference surrealism or op art or advertising art, but he was very much the exception to the rule. And what was interesting is that I was injecting into comic book graphic design things that weren't especially new or revolutionary if you saw them in the context of, say, music design, but I had to fight tooth and nail for them in comic book design because they were considered to be much more revolutionary than they actually were. It's a bit like Alan Moore famously once said that one of the only reasons people think he's a good writer is because he's writing for comics.
Your friend Grant Morrison said the same thing. I remember back in the 90s. It was, the level of the standards are not so high. I'm not a genius, but
yes,
compared to the other guys, I come off as pretty smart. So
well, exactly. And I think that in some way, like Alan, or what Alan and Grant can do is they can import stuff because they're very much broader in their appreciation of culture, and they're much more widely read than your average comic book writer was in the 70s and 80s, who were trying to regurgitate Chris Claremont tropes, perhaps. Is that this is why they sang out as being so interesting and fresh. So it's, again, maybe this is what I'm trying to do with a novel as an object, is just try and inject something from the world of graphic design and the history of pop culture and the history of 20th century art movements and typography into the rather moribund form of the novel, which I'm sure has, just as many unassummed, unexpected cliches and ways in which it binds itself without even realizing it. I think that you need to step outside of the form in order to see what the form is, and by doing so, you very quickly understand that a lot of things that maybe a lot of people take for gospel aren't at all, and you can alter them and mess with them and do things in a different way. And why not? This is all grist to the mill of creative expression.
Is there a degree, do you see prose writing? Well, you're coming from outside prose writing. I know you're right, but you're still coming with a graphic designer's eye. Do you see writers who are quote unquote native writers being willing to look outside like that to try to see, forms like this? I guess that's what I'm bringing up is the challenge, the way you say you look at it from the outside. Somebody who's sort of trapped on the inside, do you see ways of just getting them to understand what some of the potentials are? Or do they feel limited with, I don't have a graphic design background, I can't play like Ryan?
I think you'd need to ask the people, the authors in question. I think that there probably are people who are very word-based, who don't have much of a visual imagination, and I know this for a fact, working as a graphic designer for literary publishers in the past, is that you would design a cover, and there was a language that you might employ. It might be that you were using red to communicate urgency, or you were using a specific font because it had certain connotations that were relevant for what the story was about. And you would have to talk the editor through this. It was almost like they were kind of image blind. These weren't unintelligent people. They just didn't know how.
Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't know how to decode an image. In fact, it was a bit like images were written in a language which they didn't understand, mainly because they hadn't been exposed to them in the way that possibly graphic designers just assume that everyone knows how to manipulate these signs and symbols. And I think the reverse is also true. I think you probably get a lot of visual people who just cannot read words on the page. They cannot conjure an image from words on a page. They feel much more comfortable drawing that image. So again, these are people for whom their experience is somewhat narrow. And I always thought that everyone has the possibility of understanding the kind of codes that graphic designers use. They're not mysterious, or you don't have to. It's not like you go to art school and they give you a secret handbook that tells you yellow equals this and squares equal that, and the triangle means this. It's all context derived and historically derived. I mean, there's a bit in XX at the very beginning where you see the intelligentsia logo, which is Jack, our main character's company logo, and it's a black square. And he talks for a couple of pages about what black squares mean. Again, this kind of divides people into those who find these kind of diversions into the philosophy of color and shape absolutely fascinating, and it is what the book is about. And other people who are completely incomprehending about why I've gone off on another philosophical digression on semiotics or philosophy. But everyone knows that if you wear, say, certain clothes, especially if you're a teenager, you know how to signal your tribal affiliation by wearing the clothes that your favorite band wear. So that, I'm with these guys, I'm not with those guys over there. Everyone knows that you adopt a way of speaking or a way of walking or an attitude that has all of this sort of semiotic signaling that other people pick up on. They know that you're like this or like that, or and these can be very subtle inflections of visual language, this kind of social coding that people do all the time. So I see no reason why people shouldn't pick up a novel and see fonts and see photographs and sketches and images. And if you're not being obtuse and you're welcoming them into this world and you're offering them some kind of explanation as you go along, some thread that they can follow, you're not assuming too much prior knowledge, I'm hoping that they'll come along with you for the journey. And I think that thankfully that's been the case with a lot of the reviews, is that a lot of people who were initially put off by the typographic fireworks in the end, were won over and very much enjoyed it, even though they didn't think maybe that this kind of thing was for them.
Yeah, I've already identified, a half dozen pals of mine who it's just like, you're going to get this book. You're not going to know why at first. And then once it starts to unfold, you're going to understand exactly why I sent it to you. And, people trust me enough, to understand their taste, and knowing, the sorts of readers who are really going to dig into this and really groove on it, both in terms of the content and the form of it all. That's, it's quite an achievement that you put together.
Thank you.
I'm impressed. Yeah. But I guess, for you, where did the semiotics and the information and communication theory begin? Like when did you start to not just groove on it, but, you demonstrate learning of it, a deeper understanding of it, academically, intellectually in the context of the book? When did that really become a focus for you?
Well, I was never taught this at art college, and looking back at art college now, it's very much apparent to me that all the stuff that I should have been taught, like semiotics, color theory, anatomy, perspective, composition, how to design a typeface. We were taught none of this. But what does stick in my mind, we weren't even told how to write an invoice or hire someone or how to set up a company or protect your copyright or any of this kind of stuff. What we were taught about was the class struggle, the history of socialism in Soviet Eastern Europe, the struggle of the unions to throw off the chains of the aristocratic class. I mean, all of this sort of art history was coached in this at the time. I wasn't a particularly politically inclined person, but at the time, I just sort of wrote it all down in my notebooks and sort of nodded along. But it was, and this is true of so many other people who I think went through art college in the 80s, in the 90s, who had a very similar experience. I don't know whether it's like this now. In some ways, I think it might even be worse now. But, while waiting for the glorious workers' revolution and the overthrow of capitalism, which, various tutors assumed would have happened by now, I have actually had to write the odd invoice and make sure that I protect my copyright. And I've had to read contracts and all of these other sort of boring capitalist things that, they never ever taught us how to do. So I think that the grounding in semiotics that you mentioned was very much a part of what I thought art college would focus on and didn't. And unless I was napping on that day or I was off or something, but I don't remember it.
That it certainly explains the savage depiction of progressive and PC thought within XX. You've got some sections in there where it's a lampoon of I'd like to think it's a lampoon of what academics would do in the face of the signal from space and everything it entails, but I fear that you actually nailed it 100%.
I don't think there's anything I've written in those lampoons, and that goes for the right wing and the left wing. I lampoon them both. I don't think there's anything that I've put in there that I have not read at one time or another being seriously floated as a legitimate viewpoint. I didn't have to make it up. In fact, there were certain elements on the there's the podcast transcript, which it's a bit like a sort of InfoWars, but it's under unsubtle pastiche. You don't have to exaggerate this stuff. It's all there. You just have to report it. In fact, those bits have been some of the most popular parts of the novel, actually. It's the bits that everyone sort of laughs at and remarks that they like.
Yeah, I checked off numerous parts. I have little dog ears all over my... Actually, that's a question. Do you write in books, or do you just dog ear things?
I'm not... Yeah, I used to be quite precious about keeping books in a good condition, and now I'm not at all. I think I can always buy another copy if I'm that fussed. I'll dog ear, I'll write in margins, I'll tear pages out if I just need to make a sketch of something. I'm not that fussed. It's the ideas that count, not the vessel that they come in. I mean, I do actually collect old science fiction pulps and sort of vintage paperbacks, but I don't read those. I mean, they're mostly unreadable. And anything that was decent has long been collected into other books that you can pick up. All the Asimov and early Philip Dick stuff you can get in more recent books, so you wouldn't want to delve back into these flaky old pulp magazines. But mostly it's just because I like them as physical objects. I like the cover paintings, I like the graphic design, I like the smell of the paper. And in fact, on the M papers of the novel, where I pastiche the history of Ascension, the story within a story, that was very much me sort of delving into that love that I have for sort of the ephemera of the history of graphic design, all this flaking paper and old clunky paperbacks that you might come across in a junk shop. The sort of the joys of the magpie graphic designer and the kind of unexpected gems that you can throw up in your travels.
And one thing about technology that I'm interested in, we talked earlier about the advances that were necessary to make something like XX feasible, to do it, without having to wait 3 hours for each font rendering to happen. What advances do you still want to see within this overarching world of Adobe and everything else? What are the things that you think, man, if only we could do this quickly and more easily, this is the thing I would, it would take me to another level? Or do you just wait to see what comes next and then figure out how to employ it?
I can remember in the early days of freehand Adobe Fontographer, where each new version of, say, freehand was a major step forward. I can remember when you could work in color, whereas prior to that, you'd had to work in wireframe mode, and then you'd render it in the color, check to see whether the color was right or not. And then you'd have to revert to wireframe mode, adjust the color while you were in black and white, and then render it again. So all of those barriers to being able to see what you're doing, so you have immediate visual feedback for what you're doing, have pretty much been solved. So I think that the upgrades that you get now with, say, Creative Clouds are so incremental that you can almost see them scratching around to come up with something new to implement. And most of these new things that they're implementing are things like cross-platform applicability to mobile phones or something like that. It's not something that my work really is involved in at all. So it's important for some people, but probably not for what I do. Whereas I think that the long-term interface issue that we have is between what we think and our ability to put it, to externalize it. So it's what goes on inside our heads and what we manage to create outside our heads. And at the moment, for the bulk of human history, our ability to manipulate the external world was what you could do with your hands. So you needed good hand-eye coordination. You needed physical skills in order to do this. And then as the digital world sort of comes online, you could say write code. You could manipulate things that were non-physical in that they were digital, but then you could use those digital strings of numbers to create physical things. And this again is a thread of XX, where these D-men, these ghosts in the machine, the one thing that they don't have is physical corporeality. And so this is what they desire more than anything, is to somehow be as real as Jack and our other human protagonists are. But in other ways, Grant talks about this, and we spoke about this a couple of days ago, is that, Grant's take on this is that he'll talk about Superman and how Superman is a fictional character, but in a lot of ways he's more real than Grant or anyone else or you or I is. He's going to be around for decades, hundreds of years after we've gone. So it depends how you define real. So going back to your original question, I would say that the new frontier, if you like, is ways of affecting the real world directly by the mind without the manipulation of the screen or the hand or the keyboard in between. So you think and it happens. Now, this may be good. I can see myriad of ways in which this could go horribly wrong. And again, in XX, I talk about the fact that the signal from space, there's a few spoilers here, but why not? The signal from space that is received at the very beginning of the novel. One of the characters discusses the fact that had it arrived 20 years previously, all that we would have is a wiggle made by a pen on a piece of paper. It would be a
radio disturbance. Yeah.
Yes, it would be a line on a piece of graph paper, like the famous wow signal. In 20 or 30 years' time, if we're completely connected through some kind of neural implant that apparently Elon Musk is already implanting in pigs, I read this morning, if we're completely connected to information and the internet and this kind of shared consciousness that I'm sure will arise as we extend the human nervous system, we're going to come together as a culture in some cohesive form that in a lot of ways I think will have its own character and personality, just like a person might. If we received a signal from space when we were that evolved, it would go straight into our neocortex. We might be hijacked if we are information and this external information has a sort of viral quality to it. We'll be welcoming it in to our essential selves in a way. There'll be no barrier there. So we exist in a weird world, intermediate world, where the way that ideas get into our head is we still have to look at a screen or hear a sound in order for something to get into our heads. It has to come through our traditional senses. And in order to communicate an idea to someone else, we have to type it, we have to open our mouth and speak it and make the molecules of air oscillate in a way that moves an eardrum. These are very indirect forms of communication. So we're in that in-between period that I think from the perspective of history is probably going to only be about 40, 50 years in the history of mankind. So it's a very, very narrow window that I think that we occupy at the moment between the invention of the computer and the internet and our amalgamation in some way with that, so that it and us are no longer utterly clearly defined.
Do you think of that? It puts me in mind of when I recorded with Milton Glaser last year, and we were still talking solely in the space of graphic design, or design in general, that he felt computers are really good at getting people to do the things computers are really good at. Like when it came to design in particular, it was, there are effects that are easier to do on a computer than other effects, and you will sort of get funneled into doing those as opposed to the more challenging things that a computer might have more difficulty with. Is that something you feel?
I would disagree entirely. I would say that if the tool is the master of you, then you haven't mastered the tool. And I think that goes for the paintbrush or the chisel or the typewriter. It's not something new that has come along with the computer. I think that the computer is more plastic. In other words, it doesn't have a sort of a weave and a weft that say traditional materials like paint or stone or ivory would have. They have inherent grain. They have a character that you either work against or with. Whereas the versatility, plastic is probably the best word. The sort of plasticity of the digital realm means that the only texture that it has is the texture that we decide to apply to it. The only sound that it has, the only shape or form that it has are the ones that we decide that it should have. And if that is funneling you creatively in a certain direction, I would say that you need to grab hold of the steering wheel. And I think that what happens when any new technology comes along is that there'll be a lot of things that you can do that you couldn't do before. And novelty is very seductive. And so you will get a lot of people who will be seduced by the fact that they can add a drop shadow. They can make everything look like...
drop shadow. That's so 90s.
And so, but then you look back at the graphic design work or the music that has dated so fast. And it's the music that didn't come from a place of having a solid concept and an idea that it was trying to articulate. It's the stuff that just literally thought, oh, here's a new button that does this thing. I'll do that. And that looks cool. So, mentioning no names, there are certain graphic designers who were the toast of the town, shall we say, in the early days of the computer, say the mid to late 90s, and you look back at their work now, and it's just a hollow parade of cheap effect. And there's no depth or thought or anything there. There's no idea. There's no content. It's just a superficial dance of visual novelty.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's, I think from Milton's perspective, it was almost a warning along those lines that students should learn their own hand that much more so that, they're not limited by this is what a computer can do really well. I'm going to do these things. But yeah, it was an interesting conversation. Actually, another designer conversation. I should ask the same question of you. I've interviewed Stephen Heller a few times now, and it's never been quite clear to me with designers in general. Can you turn off your design eye, or do you find yourself in sort of automatic critique mode when you're...
I'm sure Steve does. Steve wrote a very nice blurb for the back of the American edition of XX, which came out last week. So I know Steve from way back. In fact, he wrote a blurb. You were talking earlier about sort of my earlier explorations of semiotics and color and shape. I did write a book called Culture, Ideas Can Be Dangerous about 10 years ago, which is more like an extended essay, which I should probably revisit at some point. And a lot of the material or a lot of the concerns, I should say, that end up in XX are in that book, but set out in a sort of way that sort of an art student could understand. So again, these concerns have been there, and Steve wrote a nice blurb for the cover of that book. But I think that anybody who works in a certain field has this problem in that they cannot just let themselves enjoy something without critiquing it at the same time. I mean, I know people who work in, say, special effects, and you'll be watching a film and they'll say, "Oh God, look at that green screen work," or the color grading on that needs fixing. That is a glitch that is this specific piece of software often throws up. So I think that. I think the same is true of musicians as well. I think it's very hard for musicians to listen to music in the way that, I mean, I cannot play a musical instrument. I can play the piano very, very badly. But that kind of almost allows me to enjoy music as if it's magic. It just happens, and I don't understand the structural aspects of it well enough to critique it on that level, but I still get it. It still moves me. I still find an emotive content in music. And I think that this is where your art approaches magic. And who was it? Arthur C. Clarke said that any technology that's advanced,
sufficiently advanced,
will be indistinguishable from magic. And I think that any form of technical prowess is the same. I think that if you watch, say, a baseball player hit a ball out the stadium, I've no idea how he does that. It's just hand-eye coordination and years of practice. Now, for him, that's not an intellectual exercise. That's just something that he's in the zone. He does. It happens. And I think that there are aspects of that in graphic design, in music, especially in filmmaking, and we as observers who are outside of that technical realm can enjoy it in a way that the technicians can't. In a way, it's our own. Yeah. It's we can't enjoy. It's a bit like if I'm reading a comic now, I'll be looking at the position of the speech bubbles or the way that the page turn is arranged in the narrative and things like that. I'll be not focusing just entirely on the story, which I should be doing.
And that's what I wonder, given your whole, given how, what design means in the day-to-day world, whether you have a ability to cut back a little bit just walking down the street, or is it, the kerning on that banner is terrible and,
I know you're always doing that. I mean, the world is full of so much hideous, bad graphic design that I think that if I was ruler of the world, the first law I would institute is that every shop sign on every high street that is, selling, I don't know, kebabs or hardware or junk or whatever it may be, they employ a decent graphic designer. There are so many graphic designers out there looking for work, and there's so much bad graphic design in the world. What we need to do is put these people together so that the world will just look more beautiful.
We should leave off on that, but I do want to ask the last question. Next work, sticking with prose, working in comics, what do you consider for your next Rian Hughes project as opposed to, work. So. Yeah,
there's always the way that things come out into the world sometimes gives the impression that there's some ordered scheme going on behind the scenes. There isn't. There's just projects that I start and then either come to fruition very quickly, maybe in a matter of months sometimes if they're sort of comic books, or, in the case of XX, take 25, 30 years to come to fruition. So there's no grand plan other than a continuing exploration of the things that fascinate me. And those things are colors, shapes, actions, language, and what they mean, what they communicate. I open my mouth and sounds come out, but they're not just sounds, they're words, and they go into your ear and your brain translates them into concepts. So in some ways, we're almost doing a little bit of a mental mind swap here. What's in my head is ending up in your head. And it's the way that works, and the way that something like typography or graphic design is at the absolute nexus of this operation, and how it can be used in ways to create narrative or art, or it can be used to persuade people or to sell people stuff. It's this kind of interface that is ubiquitous, and at the same time, a lot of people don't even know that it's there. I think since the advent of computers and the fact that now everyone who uses a computer has to actually choose a font means that in the last 20 years, I think 99.9% of the planet now know what a typeface is, now know what a font is. Prior to that, I don't think they did. So people are more familiar with this language, and they're very creative with it as well. I think you've only got to look at the way that something like Instagram, which was intended to be one thing and ended up by being another thing, evolves, is that the way that human ingenuity will take an evolutionary niche and exploit it. Whether that be, I don't know, YouTube, or the way that music is now consumed and shared, or the way that, say, podcasts. I mean, who would have thought that, 2-3 hour long podcasts would now be listened to? I mean, some of the podcasters I listen to have over 1 million listens, and we were told that in this modern computer world that everyone had short attention spans, and if it was more than 5 minutes, no one would stay with you for that long. But I think that some people have an enormous appetite for depth and nuance, and really diving deep into subjects in a way that they just couldn't before. So this, again, it's what I was talking earlier about, the democratization of anything leads to a whole lot more bad stuff, a whole lot more good stuff, and a whole lot more mediocre stuff in the middle. And if you can sort of put up with the mediocre, and just focus on the good, then it's a win, I would hope. I mean, the downside, as we know, of the way that information spreads is the way that disinformation spreads. But I think that we've just got to be more savvy about the way that we consume information. And again, this was the church's rationale for the banning of books or the controlling of printing presses, is that we couldn't allow information out there because people wouldn't know how to differentiate between good information and bad information. And we, as the elite, have to have some kind of control over this, because you, as the consumer, aren't capable of making those decisions yourselves. It's a very patronizing and sort of class-based idea of the world. And for better or worse, we've been doing away with that, especially in the last, say, 10, 15 years. I think we're seeing the fallout of that into, politics and our social lives in a big way. And again, sort of going back to XX, circuitously bringing it right back to my book again. This was the idea I had of the the celestial mechanic in the story within the story, which also mirrors the anatomy of the man on the moon, who our astronaut encounters on the far side of the moon, is that they have two brains. And the reason they have two brains is it's almost like it's like you've got your backup brain that you reside in, and then you've got your forebrain where you can test out ideas. And if they prove to be detrimental, then you can flush your forebrain and it doesn't infect your hindbrain. It's like an internal firewall. And I imagined that creatures who, say, are in the position that we might be in another 50, 100 years, where we're much more open to being infected by bad ideas. I mean, not that we aren't infected by bad ideas now. Right. That we might develop as a defense. And this alien thinks it's utterly crazy that we only have one brain. What are you doing? You're leaving yourself open to bad ideas hijacking your mind. You can't take a back seat and then just flush your forebrain of bad ideas. And it's a bit like, shutting down your computer and going back to the backup that you made yesterday because you messed up today. It's the sort of biological equivalent of that I think that aliens might evolve in a world in which bad viral ideas are just as poisonous and dangerous as biological pathogens might be. And we just, as a race, haven't developed mimetic antibodies in the same way that we've developed biological antibodies, which, again, no spoilers, is essentially what the XX, 19th Count, and Girl 21 are. They're our sort of T-cell technicians in the mimetic realm. They're our self-made defense against bad ideas. They're made of ideas, and they're there to defend us against worst ideas.
And we'll see if XX serves that purpose, for years and years to come. That's
it's almost,
like I say, it's all these thoughts and concepts that I, was grooving on so much in my college and post-college years. Seeing them, kind of incorporated and turned into fiction like this has been fantastic.
So you enjoyed it. You stuck with it right to the bitter end.
Oh yeah. No, I was grooving the whole thing. It was just even the literary pastiches, using other forms and modes within it. There was an awful lot that was just, when you read something and you know that somebody, this guy has thought about the thing I've been thinking about and, extrapolated it, worked through it. I found it utterly fascinating and really engaging.
What did you make of the third part, where I get really 2001 on you?
I was fine with it. You're attached. Well, we're giving away something, but anybody who makes it this far is probably also going to make it through 900 plus pages. When you have to leave behind the human characters we spent so much time with, for the first 2/3 of the book plus. Sad in its way, but seeing the next stages and what these things can mean, again, cosmologically, I thought was Arthur C. Clarke like, and in a good way, showing us having an influence on things that are supposedly much larger than humanity and our role in the backwaters of the galaxy. Yeah.
But what I was attempting to do there, as well as the Arthur C. Clarke analogy, again, I think is salient here, because things like 2001 and Rendezvous with Rama, they kind of end on this. The door has just opened. Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's where the book ends. And then you get the sequels, which are of diminishing returns, shall we say, because, the promise... don't open the mystery box, as J.J. Abrams tells us. So one of my sort of earliest aims with XX was to not only open the mystery box, but then to take that as far as I possibly could, literally to the point where there is no universe left. And so what I was hoping I was doing in that third part, and again, I'm probably giving away too many spoilers here, but was to sort of take the Clarkean transcendentalism, if you like, to its logical conclusion, and not just leave you on the cusp of a sort of the curtain being drawn back on a wider stage, but to actually take you across that stage and out. So I hope that sort of final part was a sort of almost like an expansive epilogue to the main event.
Yeah. No, again, works for me. And keep in mind, like I say, I'm your target reader. I may be buying a sample set here.
Yeah.
I'm the guy.
You've got up on Philip Dick and Jack Vance and all that kind of stuff. So you probably are completely my target reader.
I will put it this way: when it comes to Grant Morrison, who I actually once got his answering machine when I was calling about this book when I used to do small press publishing, I go into like Bible John, the weird painted serial killer thing he did in Crisis. Yeah, see, I go really deep dive and obscure with a lot of this stuff. So
I was designing Crisis at that period. That's the weird thing. There's a crossover there.
It would have been a few issues after they redid and finished New Adventures of Hitler. So it would have been like the 50s of Crisis. So yeah, if you talk to Grant or if you want to connect us, just say, he's a guy who seems to have read Bible John. I don't know anybody else who's ever read that. So yeah, I'm in the obscure target audience, but yeah, this book really, hit all my buttons. So seeing it go to that conclusion, I think was really, we know that's what it means. We know partway through the book that, there's either an end or there's nothing. And you achieve that by bringing us to the end. And
well, it's also about how we define consciousness. And I think that I sort of go into this at some depth as well. And again, I'm sort of warning listeners that your enjoyment of these philosophical digressions may vary. Hopefully there's enough of as FX magazine said, it reads like a thriller. So I hope that there's enough of a sort of propulsive thread to sort of pull you through the bits of philosophy that may not be completely up your street. But, if we begin as sort of single cells that then get together to make a body, so we kind of, as cells, we sort of lose our individuality within this sort of greater unity. And then maybe as humans, we form a culture and then we lose a certain degree of individuality within this culture, whether that be in an Orwellian sense or not. Then again, the sort of the third act of it is projecting that idea. So it's not just the physical idea of our characters out into the wider universe. It's where does that idea go if you take it to its logical conclusion? So you get this, again, spoiler alert. I try to sort of wonder what a kind of galaxy mind might look like, and how time would seem to pass for such an entity. Again, shadows of possibly the Star Child at the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey.
And it gets us to Kirby and the Living Planet too. But go on.
Yeah, Ego, the Living Planet.
Or a strong resemblance to Stan Lee, by the way. Sorry, go.
I do like the idea of getting Kirby. I think that. Yeah, you've got to get Kirby.
And I should frame that as I was born in 1971. So as a kid, the Kirby that I'm seeing is like that mid to late 1970s Captain America sort of Kirby that was substandard compared to, his heyday in the 60s and all that. Still, I look back at those and Machine Man and everything else. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, you just didn't look like Byrne and Austin. So I didn't get it because I was.
No, I agree. I think that's, that sort of period Kirby, like the Fourth World stuff, there's so many ideas in there, but it sort of lacks the kind of cohesion that an editor would have brought to it. And so, yes, for me, it's probably about the first 50 or 60 issues of Fantastic Four, when it was just great story after great story after great story. Those are still so readable. And I was reading those obviously way, way after the event, but in these English reprints that we used to get here that were really poorly printed, but Kirby can withstand. If anyone can withstand poor printing, Kirby can withstand poor printing.
Yeah, no, that was the. Oh, I was going to say the run of like number 40 to number 60. Like, I'll compare like the golden age of The Simpsons and things like that to what Kirby was doing, just issue after issue from that run of just, here's the Inhumans, here's a Black Panther, here's a Silver Surfer, here's Galactus, just throwing these things out one after another and bringing it all together. It was incredible. No,
it's unbeatable. It's like, and you can see where he's just holding it back from then on, when his relationship with Marvel was beginning to fall apart, and he said, I'm not going to give them any more Silver Surfers. And you can just see that it's, the art is beginning to suffer. I also think that the shrinking of the page size from the old large page format to the smaller one, Kirby was kind of drawing at the same scale, but just within smaller panel borders, which is, so you get all these weird panels where there's like 2 eyes and a mouth, and that's it. And so I think a lot of people who are coming to Kirby, when it was Silver Star and Captain Victory and those kinds of pastiche. I mean, I know those things, even those very late Kirby comics still have their aficionados, but for me, it was the earlier stuff when he was still putting a lot of work on each page, I think, that still stand the test of time.
So yeah, that could be your new concept for how we transition, Getting Kirby, which is Getting Disco is great. You trust me, I'm going to use Getting Disco at some point also. But
we'll pick up culture ideas can be dangerous, because there is a chapter in there called Getting Disco. I can't remember because I wrote it literally, 12, 15 years ago now, but it's the other phrase that I use is that you shouldn't ask apples to be oranges. I don't know whether I came up with this or whether I've mangled some other saying. I might have mangled some other saying. But if you're not, I think this is where a lot of present day conversations go off the rails, is that they're asking the thing that you're talking about to not be that thing, but be another thing. And if instead you look at the thing in and of itself, then you'll see the inherent properties of that thing as it is and be more appreciative of them. It sounds very zen. But,
no, this is my Coen Brothers lesson. I have to do this with every Coen Brothers movie because I always go into it with the framework of what I'm expecting. And invariably I get pissed off, frustrated, blah, blah, blah. And then I look back and, wait a second, if I just take it as it is, all of these things unfold, and I'm gaining all of these other things just because it's not this one movie that I loved, 25 years ago.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are disappointed with, various artistic endeavors because they have a preconceived idea of what they expect that thing to be. But I think that my issue with, say, a lot of contemporary fine art is that it doesn't do the viewer any favors. And I think that what you've got to do, especially if you're going to go off-piste in a big way when it comes to someone's expectations, is if you... you've got to lead them by the hand through this as much as you possibly can. And you shouldn't put up too many barriers to their entry. So it's a bit like another analogy is I think that, say, if you're a game designer, there are certain skills that your player will need in order to fight the boss battles and probably the big battle at the end. But you don't preload those at the front. You don't expect someone to go away and practice for 5 or 6 hours before they can play the very first level of this. It's not like, doing your scales to learn the piano. They're very adept at having this finely graded learning curve, which means that it's fun all along and you don't kind of realize that you're learning. And I think that it's a very good model for a lot of things, is that you don't expect too much prior knowledge on behalf of your reader or your viewer, and give them as many opportunities to get on board as you possibly can before you carry them off into the wild blue yonder at the end. And I think more people will come with you on your journey if you can do that. I mean, whether I've succeeded in doing that in XX or not is, despite my best efforts, I have no idea. I'm sure there will be people who find it absolutely impenetrable, and I'm sure there are. But to be honest, I have been pleasantly surprised at how many people have not only deciphered the vast majority of the layers that I put in there, but even found new sort of resonances and mirrorings of ideas that even I was not sort of fully aware of when I was putting the thing together. And I think that, again, there are points in the working of a work of art or a piece of graphic design where that begins to happen, is that you begin to almost sort of hit on a kind of deeper universalism, whether that be in color or composition or the themes that you're talking about in prose. And again, it sort of rings like this kind of harmonious chord rather than just a bunch of randomly thrown together notes that don't really add up to anything more than the sum of the parts. And it's something that when I'm doing a piece of graphic design or a drawing or whatever, you can almost feel the point at which that happens. It's like you're walking up a seesaw and it's just hard work because you're going uphill and you're not really sure where you're going or what the destination is. And then what happens is you approach that sort of point of balance where it's kind of tipping under you and it feels slightly disconcerting, but you know that something interesting is happening. And then everything seems to fall into place, and then you almost shoot down the other side of the seesaw because all of the I described it in the book as the semiotic bolts ram home. It's almost like everything falls into place. And if you've done the work on the way up, when you go over that wobbly point in the middle where everything's in this kind of weird state of flux, and then you're traveling down the slope on the other side, you sometimes can be completely surprised by the things that come up. And you think, did I put that there? I don't remember putting that in there. But oh God, it works well because, in this part of the design, I have this going on. So that is a mirror and a reply, a sort of counterpoint, if you like, to that thing going on over there. And as long as you can, keep a firm hand on the tiller so that you're not seduced by everything that comes across your desk at this point, you have to sort of have one eye on the edit, I think, which is why 350 pages came out of XX. But it's when the thing takes on a life of its own and you can see it in its entirety. And it's like this little spinning constellation of, it's much easier to see in a piece of graphic design or in a drawing because you can look at the thing and see it and take it all in its entirety in one look. Whereas what I've noticed or what I've found with writing a novel is it's so much harder to do that because it's something that has a time element to it. A film might take up 2 or 3 hours of your life, whereas a novel will take up, I don't know, depending on how fast you read, several days or several weeks of your life. So you've got to hold the whole thing in your mind's eye at once in order to see the shape of the thing. And the bigger the thing is, the harder it is to do that. So again, I would not, if there are readers out there who just cannot get their head around XX, I apologize, and it's probably entirely my fault for making it as long as it is and with as many philosophical digressions as it has. But it is what it is.
And it has. Listeners, he's selling it short. Don't worry. There's great compelling stuff. There are scenes on the moon that will keep you on the edge of your seat. There is all sorts of there's great action to it. There's great thought. The typography and the various literary genres you bring in, it all makes for a compelling reading, as far as I'm concerned. And from what you're saying, it really fits in that line that there's no first reading of a book. The first time you read a novel, you're not going to get it because you're experiencing it on a number of immediate levels. It's when you go back and start revisiting something, that's when the shapes and the resonances really start to occur, I think.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I think that, again, the kind of physicality of the object of the book as a vessel is something that I refer to all the time. In fact, on the American edition, there's a scene in the book where Jack picks up a book to explain something to one of the other characters, and he says, "See, this book here, it has a height and a width and a depth. It has extension in space. It occupies volume." And you realize that what he's actually lifted up is the book that you're reading. And so on the cover of the American edition, there is an X and a Y dimension printed on the back cover, and then a Z across the spine. So there are all these little Easter eggs in there for those so inclined to do a deep dive. I mean, they're not essential to your enjoying of the story. They're like little side quests, if you like, for those of you who enjoy deciphering such things. And also on the to again sort of emphasize the physicality of the object as a sort of again without sounding too pretentious, semiotics. If you separate something into the sign and what it means, the symbol and the symbolized, you can talk about the book as an object. It's made of paper and glue and board and printer's ink. But then, say a telephone directory is indistinguishable on a chemical point of view from the works of Shakespeare. So what's salient about the works of Shakespeare is not a physical description. It's what that physical description encodes. It's what it says in the language and the words that are written on the page. So that is one of the major themes of XX, the interrelationship of the physical expression of an idea and the idea itself, and how some ideas don't or might wish to have physical expression, and how some physical expressions may express ideas, but not necessarily the ideas that you may intend, which is where the whole talking to aliens sort of chapter comes in, is that they're trying to render the signal and various alien communications into a way that they might be able to comprehend. And they managed to create graphic depictions of these sort of alien vocabularies, these alien orthographies. And so you have several pages in there where I thought, well, how might aliens language have developed? So imagine, for example, that you're a dolphin and you develop a sophisticated language in which the bubbles that you blow out of your blowhole are used for communication. So it might be big bubbles or small bubbles or bubbles close together or bubbles with big gaps between them. And so if they then developed a written language, maybe the written language would be like vertical lines of dots, and the dots would either be bigger or smaller or widely spaced or whatever. So there's a page of dolphin, what I imagine evolved dolphin language might look like.
Yeah.
And then I imagined another sort of alien race in which they, in order to signal to other members of their tribe or whatever, they tie knots in their hair. So imagine if you had a very long beard, and depending on precisely where the knot was and how many of them there were, and etc. So their orthography might be something that looks like a musical stave with points on this stave. And then I had another idea where when people go on pilgrimages to a holy site, they might take a stone with them and then leave a stone on a pile. I thought that maybe if you got a written language that evolved out of that, so you would have vertical piles of different sized blobs that looked a bit like rocks, and depending on how precariously balanced they were and how tall the pile was, you could express different emotions or whatever. So there's about 10 pages in XX where I attempt to come up with as many sort of bizarre alien orthographies as I possibly could. Mainly because it really annoys me in TV shows where the Enterprise will meet an alien race and they'll speak perfect English with an American accent.
Yeah.
It annoys me so much. I think they have a communicator, but I think
universal translator. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you met an alien, there'll be so much communicated. Is he standing? Is he sitting? Is he offering his hand out to shake your hand? Is he holding a hand up, palm outward? He might not be a he. He might be some ungendered sort of multi-part biological entity for which all the kind of commonalities that we might bring to bear have no analogue whatsoever. So our gap of comprehension might be enormous. And I think that I think Arrival was a very interesting story and movie in that respect, is that I think that is much more likely to be how our experience of communicating with aliens will pan out, is that it might be years, even decades work to even come up with the most basic language that we can use. Because it might not even be that the way that they are made means that they're interested in communicating in the first place. But even that might be a peculiarly sort of human idea, that we want to talk to aliens. Why would we want to do that? So all of these assumptions that make for interesting science fiction that we can go back to first principles and examine and see where that gets us. I think that so much, I don't know what, like I said, I'm not that up on current literary science fiction, so I'm really hoping that some people, if they listen to this, can sort of point me in the direction of some sort of genre-busting experimental science fiction that might be up my street. But so much of the science fiction that I see on TV just assumes that meeting aliens is no more difficult than going to Spain on holiday with a phrase book.
Yeah, I'm with you. I flash back like you do to 50s and 60s SF, and the one that jumps to mind for me is Solaris. That's Stanislaw Lem, where there's something that entire world may be intelligent, but it's not an intelligence we have any way of reckoning with. That there is no communication. It's plumbing our minds, but we don't even know why. I go back to that book every year or two just when I need to remind myself of the ineffability of human communication. Yeah. It's always nice to say, oh yeah, no, they've tackled this one long ago. We could study as much as we want, but there's, this barrier between us and the next person over. So.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think that, there's that scene where Dana on the moon is trying to figure out how to communicate with this, spoiler alert again, sort of crashed alien, and how much of our, the way that we communicate is a byproduct of our human biology. The fact that we have an orifice in a sensory cluster at the top of our bodies that was originally evolved for eating and chewing. So it has a tongue and teeth and lips, but this has then subsequently been repurposed as we became more intelligent as a race into a device for moving the air molecules in such a way that we can talk. These are all utter chances of biology. It could have gone a completely different direction, and probably would do if you rewound evolution. There's no reason why the end product, or the current product, would resemble us in any way. So, but one of the things that, again, spoiler alert, is that I got around this by having this alien entity interface directly with Dana's mind. And what she then does is that she then gets direct access to the contents of this alien creature's consciousness, and then has to convert for us, the reader, into words what it is that she now knows. So our language barrier is sort of shifted, if you like, to two consciousnesses occupying her mind. And then, so it's not so much the alien language being translated, it's her trying to talk in English about what she now knows. Yeah. But also what she gets to see is how the alien saw her, and how
what a tongue looks like to an alien. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The alien imagines that the tongue is like this slug creature occupying a kind of exoskeleton, and it's got a ring of white objects around it, which are teeth, and it's sitting inside this sort of fleshy body that's, again, inside a spacesuit of some kind. The alien is trying to figure out exactly what a human is. And so the human character manages to see herself through the eyes of an alien and see herself as an alien might see her, which I hope was interesting.
Oh, yeah. Like I say, people who listen to this show will love this book. So I figure you've got some readership built in. But I'm going to get back to my Sunday afternoon. Ryan, this has been a lot of fun. And I'm so thankful that, well, I found you on social media. I found the book coming out, and I'm glad it's out in time for the holidays here in the U.S. So,
well, thank you. And, this has been great fun. And we've been going almost 2 hours, which is just flown by. So, thank you. And thank you for your enthusiasm, and spread the word.
Will do. I
will spread the word of your podcast, because I've been doing a deep dive into your back catalogue, and there are so many great graphic designers and comic book people, science fiction authors I've been listening to, so much great stuff. So again, if people are coming to this new, I really recommend doing a back catalogue deep dive into this.
I've got about 400 past episodes, so
wow.
I'm so glad to have you in the archives, as it were. I could make an XX reference to the signal and what it actually contains, but again, we'll leave that for the readers.
Yeah, no more spoilers. I think I've given away too many spoilers.
People love it. Thanks so much, Ryan. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Gil. Bye.
And that was Rian Hughes. His new novel is XX, from Overlook Press in the U.S. and Picador in the U.K. It's an amazing book, and I so hope that you get to check it out. You can also look up more of Ryan's work through his site, RianHughes.com, which is RianHughes.com. And that's got his typography work and illustration, and it links to the agency that he runs. Anyway, you can also check out Ryan on Twitter and Instagram as Rian Hughes, all one word, and spelled the same way. There'll be links to that in the show and episode notes for this one. In the before time, this is when I would mention my Patreon and PayPal and how you can support the podcast. But I don't want you to support the podcast financially, because I'm doing just fine. The expenses are minimal. And I'd rather you dedicated your money to helping other people and institutions in need. If there are people with Kickstarters, GoFundMes, Indiegogos, Patreons, show them some support. There are institutions out there, food banks, freedom funds, things along those lines. There are a lot of ways to help fix the world, and this is a world that is in serious need. So if you can help, please do. It's Thanksgiving week here in the States, and there are probably other people who are in greater need than you are right now, so do what you can. And be safe, okay? Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.